beloved comrades down in the pit on Montrose Avenue doing an occupation of a construction site against National Grid. So when we ask the question of what is a sacrifice zone, we have a very straightforward answer. We're going to elaborate a little bit on here, and that is a community. A sacrifice zone is a community that empire destroys for its own profit. In what follows, we're going to take that apart in detail, but just as a beginning, let's go through that really, really quickly and shape the contours of the meaning of that. So when we ask what's being sacrificed in North Brooklyn, the obvious answer is the well-being of the community and its future generations. How is it being sacrificed? Well, through this project, we're being locked into paying for and future dependence on an energy system which is destroying human societies and life, indeed all life itself, not only here in North Brooklyn, but all over the world. Who is carrying out the sacrifice? Who is wielding the knife, as it were? The US empire. And by that we mean not at all a metaphor, something very real. Those with wealth and power in our society, capitalists, their collaborators in government, doing the same thing they've been doing for generations and centuries, particularly to Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks since capitalism and colonialism began. Why are they doing it? For the same reason they've always done it. It's because National Grid, the banks that loan them money and make money off that, the pipeline companies that get to pass their natural gas and oil to utilities like National Grid, the politicians they have in their pockets, the entire class of people whose interests they defend so that they can protect and increase their wealth and power and their ability to protect that power from the rest of us. So those are, in our view, are the contours of the idea of sacrifice on which we're going to elaborate as we go forward this afternoon. I think one of the questions we should answer right away, because there are many folks, I'm sure, on this call who are somewhat new to the environmental terminology. They hear the word fracking. Let's talk about what fracking is. Next slide, please. Next one after that. When we say fracking, what we mean is a process that it's very much like, in a way, like the process that was used to extract oil from the ground in terms of like digging wells, but it is a technological development of that process which allows them to extract oil that's actually absorbed in rock formations under the surface of the earth. What they do is they inject high pressure fluid into these rocks where the oil is saturating them. It breaks up the rock. There's stuff in the fluid that extracts the oil and gas that's in the rock, and it dissolves into the fluid. The pressure allows them to bring that fluid mixture of the original fluid that they sent down the well, along with the oil and gas, which is now dissolved in it, back to the top. They separate those out and they then ship it, transport it, put it into pipelines, et cetera. That whole process is called fracking, or technically hydraulic fracturing. Now, fracking is currently banned in New York and has been since 2014. But nevertheless, frack gas that's produced elsewhere, like in Pennsylvania, can still pass through New York State. Any guesses as to what happens when frack gas is transported? Next slide, please. When it's transported, it leaks. So it leaks from the pipelines, it leaks from the trucks, it leaks from the pools, from the wastewater. It's in the waste materials that come up from the well. It is in the runoff and spills and burn-offs and all the things connected with the industrial processes. Now, National Grid and other fossil fuel companies are trying to tell us that all of these processes of leakage and spillage are minimal and that they don't have an environmental impact. That's actually like a falsehood, a lie. Let's be frank about it. These pipelines do leak. They have an enormous amount of fluid that vaporizes into the atmosphere from pipelines, from compressor stations, from all the equipment that's used in the production and transportation of frack gas, as well as in the combustion, the final use of it, which we call the natural gas life cycle, by the way. And when they do spill, what do they spill? They spill methane, which is the fundamental component of frack gas, also called natural gas. Next slide. Now, this methane is poison, right? It already accounts for 44% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and its global warming potential, and by that I mean, how does it compare to an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide, which is the standard global warming substance or factor in the atmosphere? Within a 20-year period, methane has been shown to have a global warming potential 86 times to 105 times worse than that of an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. So 1 pound of methane released into the atmosphere produces 86 times as much global warming temperature increase as the same amount of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. The little picture is a plume of methane being released from a fracking site. More and more of that has been done over the years, and more that's actually made it clear that methane is a real problem that the fossil fuel companies have been hiding and lying about for years and years and years. But now it's coming to a head. Next slide. So I've got some questions for y'all. When you think about it, what's the most confusing thing to you about fracking at this point, given that we've kind of like zipped through a basic explanation? And then secondly, what's the most frightening or most unjust thing to you, or that appears to you, about fracking as a whole industry or process with relationship to some of the things you've observed and heard today and in the past, and what you know now? If anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat, and I'll take those questions. I'll take a couple of those questions and try to answer them for you. It sounds like we have astute students on the phone, on the line. We all know what a real problem this is, and how damaging this process, this substance, and the industries that it promotes and that live by it, make profits by it, are to human life and to the environment. That's really great. Let's go on to the next slide. So we asked the question, okay, we've defined sacrifice zone, we've defined this factor that when it's working in a community or in an area or in an environment, it causes a huge degradation of the environment, human harm, it's toxic and everything to the people within the community and to nature, animals, water, everything as a whole. How is North Brooklyn a sacrifice zone in terms of this very process being developed in the community right now? To step back from that a little bit, let's frame it in terms of like how that process of framing it is being set up. And for that, we need to understand a notion called the rate case. Oh, I see we have a question. How can we as individuals really fight this, and how do we effectively get the word out? The way that we fight this is we oppose the actual process of building and constructing and getting approval for these pipelines. We refuse to pay for them, and we refuse to be willing payers into the capitalist system that finances and funds them. So there's all kinds of ways that, all kinds of modes of strategies and tactics that can be employed to that end. There can be stopping things in their tracks as they're being done and shutting down production, like the direct actions did most recently in North Brooklyn. There can be actions to put pressure on banks to get banks to remove the easy access to funding that they provide to fossil fuel companies. There can be, such as are being contemplated now within the movement at large, larger actions that could involve multiple activist communities and multiple communities, like utility strikes, for instance. So there's a lot of different ways that we can oppose this. We can bring people in who are affected in different ways by the capitalist system in an intersectional process, which allows us to support our many and varied demands for different things. There's the question of indigenous sovereignty over land, and revoking settler capitalist notions of exclusive ownership of huge tracts of land that were originally stolen through genocidal means in the first place. If those actions revert to indigenous sovereignty, in fact, the actual track record shows that those have an immediate effect on the concerns of environmental justice. Look at the enormous impact that the resistance of the Sioux Nation has had on the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, and the resistance that the Wet'suwet'en Nation in so-called British Columbia has had on the development of Trans-Canada. These indigenous communities acting in concert with other indigenous nations have been able to literally shut down these processes. So there's a reason, incidentally, for putting indigenous concerns and stewardship and sovereignty at the center of our movements. In fact, as far as we're concerned, those things have to be centered to begin with. Okay, so I hope that was a good question about what to do and things that we can do. And I want to go into a little bit of a discussion about the rate case. This is a very gnarly, wonky, super and super technical issue, but I want to keep it simple and in the interest of time kind of fly along. So first of all, utility companies we say, what is a rate case, you ask? So what we would answer is this: utility companies in New York are not allowed to increase the amounts they charge customers for electricity and gas unless it's approved by the state. So they get this, to get this approval, they submit a request to increase rates. There's a bureaucracy called the New York State Public Service Commission, which reviews these requests, PSC, which you may have seen in things that you've read or things that you've heard people say. The PSC reviews the paperwork that the utility submits, trying to justify why they need the extra money to do whatever they're going to do on the ground. Typically in the past, historically, it's been to expand the existing fossil fuel infrastructure and pipeline infrastructure that they use. There's a limited process for public review and input of the information that the company submits. I'll say two things really quickly about that process. A, it provides for only a very limited scope of public input. And B, it's designed ultimately to fast track the approval process through from start to finish with minimal input from the communities. So this entire process, beginning with the companies ask for an increase and ending with the PSC making their decision, that's the rate case. The current rate case has a history that I'm going to encapsulate in bullet point fashion, hitting just the main points right now. Why is fracking already started in Bed-Stuy in my neighborhood under the guise, and no politician has told us that this is going to happen? I'm getting to it right now. In April of 2019, National Grid filed for a rate increase with PSC. They were saying that it would produce a 20% increase in their yearly gas revenues, which are hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Estimates that people who've studied the submissions in the rate case suggest that it's going to amount to about an increase of $200 a year per each billed customer, or $16 a month. So if you're an average customer using, getting gas from National Grid, you can expect to pay an additional $16 a month if this rate case goes through. National Grid, they're asking for the money for, like what I said, to make improvements. So there's projects in North Brooklyn, there's projects in Staten Island, and there's projects in Long Island. The ones that we're focusing on, of course, in our current efforts to resist this are the North Brooklyn projects. I'm going to give you like a breakdown of those really quickly and give you the cost, which is the most important thing that I want to point out here. There's phases 1 to 4. You probably heard of the phases. And those involve the construction of new pipeline. And for the most part, those are near completion, phases 1 to 4. The total cost of those plans to ratepayers, what we're paying for them to do this, is $188 million. There are various parts of that we'll get into a little bit further on, but it's phases 1 to 4. The other part of the North Brooklyn project is phases 4 and 5. Phase 4 kind of has an overlap. And the company calls these proposals long-term infrastructure projects, which means they're building things that are connected to the pipeline to serve other purposes. And in the case of these infrastructure projects, the cover story is that their infrastructure that's designed to allow them to meet peak demands in situations like where the seasons like the height of summer, the depth of winter, when there's an extraordinary demand for gas and or electricity for heating or air conditioning. They're still under review in the rate case, these phase 4 and 5, particularly, of course, phase 5 projects. But the cost that's estimated for those is $185 million. That's on top of the $188 million. Then there's these expansion of the CNG and liquefied natural gas facilities where they're building, expanding liquefied natural gas tanks and facilities in Greenpoint. The cost of those is expected to be on top of the 185 and the 188, another $108 million, almost $109 million. So on paper, the minimal cost of this entire project is almost $500 million, $465 million. And again, that's money that they're extracting from the ratepayers. That's the money they use to pay the loans back, to service the loans they take from the bank for much more to build all this. The banks make money off the loans. We service the loans. We get all the downside problem with fracking, the toxic accumulations in our communities, global warming, rise of sea levels, like such as, caused the rise of Hurricane Sandy and other catastrophes, which wiped out whole neighborhoods in Brooklyn just a few years ago, et cetera. And a few people at the top of the pyramid in our society make money hand over fist. Sounds like a sacrifice zone to me. But to put this further on the ground, let's look at some maps. These beautiful maps that were made up courtesy of the coalition that we're going to use here to show you some familiar things from a high altitude perspective, as it were. Next slide, please. So on the left, you can see a map of the entire North Brooklyn project from phases 1 to 5, starting in Brownsville, moving up through Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, going into Williamsburg and ending in Greenpoint. That's moving from north to south. You'll note that down at the bottom on the left of the map, there's a number of different types of facilities and community organizations that are impacted by just the passage of the pipeline alone. And there's a list provided there. And that list includes the following: 81 daycare facilities, 55 public schools, 9 healthcare centers, 8 private schools, 3 emergency service, 3 EMS stations, 3 nursing homes, and 1 medical center. So in other words, this pipeline and its emissions footprint pass within close proximity to all of those facilities, structures, and the individuals who are in them. public schools, children, healthcare centers, ill people, nursing homes, elderly people, et cetera. So that's the toxic footprint that we have in mind for a pipeline that wasn't even approved by the community at large. On the right, we have the phase 1 area, which is a zoom in view. And that went from Linden Boulevard, goes from Linden Boulevard to Glenmore Avenue in Brownsville. That was completed in 2018. Next slide, please. Here's a zoom in view of the phase 2 and 3 areas. There's several streets in Brownsville and Bushwick, and then phase 3, which ran from Evergreen Avenue to Gates Avenue and Central Avenue in Bushwick, and that was completed last fall in 2019. And then on the right, we see the phase 4 and phase 5 areas, which bring us roughly into the present period, going around Flushing Avenue, Wilson Avenue, Montrose Avenue, and Leonard Street in Bushwick and East Williamsburg, near completion this fall. And then Montrose Avenue, Manhattan Avenue, and Maspeth Avenue in East Williamsburg and Greenpoint, and that's expected to be completed by next fall. At this point, if we check in on the construction status, the general feeling from folks that I've talked to on the ground and people within FOBK is that at this point, almost all of the phase 1 to 4 pipeline work in North Brooklyn appears to have been completed, with the exception of additional back work being done in Brownsville relating to an apparent sewer line problem, is my understanding. At least that's what people are experiencing there. Could you explain a bit more about their agenda, what that means exactly? I'm going to keep going on, Eden, and if you can, if you make your question a little bit more pointed, I'll be glad to answer it. But I think that the agenda that's emerging is the agenda that I expressed as I was going along, which is, they're building this thing regardless of its impacts upon human beings, upon the environment, for purposes of profit and bailing out the machine, namely the fossil fuel industry, that is their machine for making profits. Okay, so if we go into the rate case, and I'm not going to go into all the many detailed objections that have been made, but just some of the glaring ones so you can see how, to what extent, to what an egregious extent the National Grid Plan fails to meet science-based and state environmental targets under the Climate Leadership and Protection Act that was recently passed, and locks in environmental racism. So take, for example, the leak-prone pipeline replacement part of the project, the LPP as National Grid calls it. They presented this to the PSC saying that the emission and leak levels from this pipeline build are going to be acceptable, but they actually deliberately underestimate the amount of methane gas likely to be emitted in this and all the other parts of the project. And the way that they do that is they don't use the 20-year impact for methane in their calculations of the impact of methane from their operations, in their reports, in their documents to PSC. They use a 100-year time frame. The 100-year time frame is a little bit more than 1/4 of the total impact that you would get in the 20-year. So it's 86 versus 25 times. So when you actually use like 1/4 of the size of the impact in your estimates, it makes your estimates look smaller than they really are. It's a way of manipulating numbers and a way of manipulating science to their advantage. But the problem is that it's not real science and the numbers aren't real. Another example, let's take the Metropolitan Reliability Infrastructure process, which is the new pipeline that was laid in North Brooklyn in phases 4 and 5. They claimed in their submissions to the PSC that the North Brooklyn pipeline would be in the community's interest. The community has these demands and needs for gas to heat their homes and to cook and everything else. And we're just supplying things that the community needs. the fact of the matter is that the community wasn't consulted, and community impacts of the actual pipeline and its emissions weren't ever considered in their evaluations. They didn't do a greenhouse gas emissions evaluation of the MRI project. They didn't do any studies to determine the impact of the project on the communities of color that it's being built in. We're gonna share links after this. There's a link, there's a map that shows how the entire route of phases 4 and 5 is within potential environmental justice areas of communities of color. Another example, North Brooklyn communities like Brownsville already have abnormally high adult asthma rates. There's an article which recently came out in the New York Times, which was based on studies that were done that shows that Brownsville's asthma rates, adult asthma rates, are the highest in the city at 14%, and lowered life expectancies. Again, Brownsville and the North Brooklyn area being among the lowest, a full 10 years less than wealthy neighborhoods like the Upper East Side in New York City, all of which is due, if you dig into the facts, to the effects of existing environmental racism under settler capitalism. And the under settler capitalism part is important because that refers to the lack of access to affordable health care, the lack of access to living in communities that are out of the scope of toxic build-outs like this, all kinds of compromising conditions due to low quality of life in terms of like access to affordable housing, police violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these factors conspire under settler capitalism, which generates them to produce the statistics that I just mentioned. And these emissions will make these disparities even worse. So you go through the rate case and you see all these things. Oh, one more that's actually really quite egregious. And that has to do with the safety of the gas being delivered in terms of its immediate potential fatality impact on health. What was actually discovered recently is that there are in recent years is that there are high levels of radioactivity in the shale in Pennsylvania where this gas is fracked, where the gas that National Grid is passing through to us is found. What we found is that in this investigative report is that this radioactivity passes through from the gas and builds up in the pipelines, in the compressors, in the equipment, in the tanks of the trucks, on the surfaces of things that are exposed to the gas. Literally, like a residue builds up that's actually radioactive. When people who were on the rate case, activists who were on the rate case, pointed all these statistics out to them, National Grid's response was, they don't believe that radioactivity testing should be conducted and that it's still their position that they should not have to invest funds to test for it in the gas that they delivered. So known carcinogenic impact of the gas, National Grid's response, we don't care, we're going to do business as usual anyway. As I said, we're going to be sending links to confirm all the factuality of all these things. These are not stories we're making up. Next slide, please. So this is like just really quickly, this is a process of building in the midst of the community. And by the way, all of this build that happened in the last year was enormously disruptive to the small businesses, to the community, and all the community buildings that are on these streets. As for example, traffic was cut off, some of them had to close their doors, et cetera. Enormously impacted on Marqueta and other areas within North Brooklyn that depend on the free passage of people for their livelihoods. Do you think they went to the people at La Marqueta, the small merchants in La Marqueta, the people in the schools, the people in these bodegas, and asked them, how they could do this so that they could like minimize the impact upon their businesses? No, they did not. To clarify, the gas would be going through this pipeline is not servicing Brooklyn. So the rate increases for New Yorkers who would be paying for a service that is not even servicing their community. Iman, that is correct. So the idea is that any of the gas that would not go to people in the community would be excess and throughput that they could store and use for other purposes. And those other purposes could include, if business conditions permit, exporting that gas from the facilities that they'd be able to create under the rate case, and or exporting it locally to petrochemical facilities, which very possible under current economic conditions and political conditions, that they could get a foothold and a footprint to be able to build those types of facilities in this area. In fact, as we'll see, there's already a facility that could be retooled for petrochemical production being built in northeastern Pennsylvania at this very moment, but more on that later. Next slide, please. So we answered our questions, or at least I tried, moving at lightning speed. How is North Brooklyn a sacrifice zone? The effects of methane leaks on the community and the way that that's being implemented and sustained from what it's always been through the rate case. Next slide, please. This is all of our brave comrades from Frack Out of Brooklyn and other folks in the coalition, again, doing civil disobedience on site, shutting down. And these CD actions were very successful in many cases. On one particular day, as I recall, because I was there, one of the days that I was there for these CDs, we actually shut down production for 1.5 to 2 days running. And of course, got the message out to many, many people in the community by doing so. So bravo and kudos to all my brave comrades who risked arrest and toxification by occupying these construction sites in the midst of work that was being done there. Next slide. Okay, folks, another question, a couple of questions. Can you think of any other ways that North Brooklyn is a sacrifice zone under settler capitalism? And can you think of any other sacrifice zones in New York City or elsewhere? I'll give a few seconds for that. Or you can just throw the questions in as we move along. Would Rikers Island count as a sacrifice zone? I think mass incarceration is a sacrifice zone in and of itself. I think the way that they constructed policing and the criminal justice system to take Black and brown and indigenous folks who they have decided are economically useless and superfluous and put them in jail for no other reason that they aren't employable in the system for low-wage labor. They create classes of crimes for them that criminalize their ability to make living by other means because they're shut out of the market. So for example, right, we have a multi-state, soon to be national legalization of all kinds of substances that were for years used to lock up hundreds of thousands of Black, brown, Latinx, indigenous folks in jail for possession, for use of these so-called substances. These are substances which now in certain states like Colorado and other places, middle class and upper middle class folks settler folks are going to be able to make small businesses selling and buying and selling and producing this stuff because it's legalized. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands and millions, literally millions of people are in the pipelines of the criminal justice system for all the years that this was criminalized in a so-called war on drugs, which was really a war on Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities throughout the United States to remove people that otherwise would have been a political and social liability from the streets. There's a lot to support that view. That's my view. And we can talk more about that at length. So yeah, Rikers is a sacrifice zone. And the building of facilities like Rikers that destroy human life, cause social and physical death, and destruction of people's opportunity and ability to function. People get out of prison and they have sharply reduced chances of being employable or making any kind of further progress in their life. They're just shut out of society, period. And that's all by intent of the capitalist system. So that's a great example of a sacrifice zone. We don't want to change the system, so we lock people up who don't fit into our system's definition of progress, and we keep going from there. And that's one reason why the United States has the highest per capita incarceration rate of any country in the world right now. But we're not talking about that today. That's a great intersectional issue. I appreciate that question, but let's move forward into the next level. Next slide, please. So North America, and as you can see, you've seen in the news, the problems that the oil industry has been having. Those problems relate to overproduction and oversupply. So right now, Turtle Island, as settlers call it, North America, has an excess of fracked gas. The prices for oil and gas have plummeted. They were negative in May, but they were plummeting even before COVID. And that was due to oversupply that exceeded domestic market demand. So remember, and this is in reference to a question that one of the folks had before, all of this fracking was done to ensure energy under the cover story of ensuring energy independence for the United States. But the real aim, and the overproduction shows it, is that it was also viewed as a way to advance American interest in controlling global petroleum markets, which had been done for years by just controlling the production of oil in these other countries by overthrowing governments, wars like the Iraq War, et cetera. This is like another extension of that whole thing. So the energy independence means once the energy independence was satisfied, you have all this immense throughput that can actually be sold for export to make the people who produce it very wealthy. And that was the idea of fracking as it was inaugurated under the Bush administration by a guy named Dick Cheney. We'll go into that history at some other time. But the warmongering and everything else are very much a part of the strategy here. But the problem that they ran into in the post-2010 environment is that other countries like Russia, Nigeria, the Arab Emirates, et cetera, formerly colonized places, decided that they wanted to compete and produce oil and natural gas for themselves. So it proved not to be so easy to get rid of the oversupply of oil and gas that was available because of fracking. They had gotten banks and other investors to invest heavily in the processes here in the United States with vastly overestimated amounts of what they would expect to be able to sell and produce abroad. When they couldn't meet those targets of selling, they couldn't pay back their debts. And when they couldn't pay back their debts, they began to fall into mass bankruptcies. So since the peak in 2015, when investor confidence in fracking was at a high, you didn't have the resource wars that are happening between the Russians and OPEC and the American oil companies at this point. You had a situation where they were making a lot of money at that point, but all of their ability to sell the excess that they have has gone down the tubes, and the debts have continued to pile up. And the investment community at large worldwide is backing more and more away from fracking companies as buying their stock, giving them loans, et cetera. So I get to a few graphs that show that really, really quickly, and we'll move on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a graph of a benchmark oil price called WTI crude. If you look at this graph, it tells the same story that I told, so I'm going to be really brief. You can see going from right to left, about late February, early March, the COVID hit on oil consumption. In other words, people weren't driving and doing other things that they were doing before. Begins to hit, and you see that precipitous drop in the price of oil because of the oversupply. In May, we reached a literal negative price. The first time in history, oil had reached a negative price of minus $37 a barrel. The Trump administration, quintessential racist settler governance in this society, immediately went into action to save their comrades in exploitation. They took our money, taxpayers' money from the CARE Act, and printed money to something they pretended like they could never do for the poor and the Black, brown, and Indigenous people in this country, to bail out the big companies they wanted to bail out, which included the oil companies. So there was a recovery of the price, but you can see going over to the right that it flatlined. Even with the increase in economic activity during the COVID period and the bailouts, the prices haven't come anywhere near attaining the prices that they were at, the levels that they were at in late 2019 and early 2020. And if I did the graph for 2015, when the price was at nearly $100 a barrel, you could see that you would be able to see that the industry itself has suffered a drastic downturn. And there's a lot of factors for that. Some of which I mentioned. I'm going to mention a couple more in just a moment. Next slide, please. This is an indication from a trade paper, a financial analyst, Wolf Street, that shows the things that I was just mentioning. You'll note that on the left, we've had, through the first half of 2020, over 260 bankruptcy filings for fracked gas companies, totaling $262 billion in assets flushed down the toilet because these companies were so damned greedy that they couldn't pay back their debts after projecting profits way above their ability to satisfy them with sales. On the right, you see another graphical representation of bankruptcy debt. Notice 2018 to 2020, 17 billion, 2019, 35 billion, 2020, $55 billion in bankruptcy debt. So that's companies filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and because they can't pay back these debts. But what does that mean? That means that the banks, the individual investors, the bondholders, the people who have stock in these companies lose part or all of their money that they invested in these companies. In fact, the effects of all these bankruptcies within the fossil fuel economy are so significant that banks are actually publishing reports and studies indicating that an increase in this kind of failure could actually have devastating impacts on the economy as a whole. So the idea is that these failures of these industries could actually precipitate another situation like 2008, when a certain segment of the economy, namely the banking industry, failed and caused the entire global economy to fail. It's that serious. Next slide. Meanwhile, the effects, right? This is a picture of the Oregon wildfires. These fires, such as in Oregon and California, themselves produce billions of dollars worth of damage and billions of dollars worth of loss of diversity of species, loss of species, very toxic and dangerous conditions for life, for human life and animal life in the areas that have been burned, degradation of water resources, huge economic impacts from all these disasters. That includes not only these fires, that includes hurricanes, tornadoes in the south, in the Gulf of Mexico area, in the southeastern part of America, melting of ice caps that produce water to fuel rivers. There's a problem with the Colorado River that supplies water to much of the Southwest, including California. There's going to be increased droughts in California due to global warming, on top of which there's going to be much less of a throughput of water from the Colorado River system. All these things are combining to produce devastating human and economic impacts. And that's just in the settler world. Already in the developed and global South, huge impacts of climate change are already being seen. But we'll get to that. Next slide. This slide is kind of like a metaphorical slide for what I mean by stranded assets. So I got a little bit into that just before. These companies are worried that they won't be able to sell the gas that they've already bought. But that also means what? That if hundreds of millions of people are locked into a fossil fuel system that can't produce the energy that it produces profitable to itself, what is the situation amounting to? It amounts to a situation where hundreds of millions of people paying to still get their energy from fossil fuels are paying to sustain the life of companies that couldn't sustain themselves on their own by doing normal business. In other words, we're not only locked into the global warming effects and toxic effects of fossil fuels. At that point, we're economically locked into alternatives that don't even make any money for us to be, that don't even make economic sense for us to be locked into. So it's a hugely devastating effect on the economy. Again, bankers, economists, the capitalists who already see it in their interest to be worried about this, they're all writing about stranded assets and everything else. In fact, the fossil fuel companies themselves are writing down the value of their assets in the face of this. For instance, Shell company this past year just wrote down assets connected with extreme energy, fracking, and other kinds of operations by a total of $21 billion in one fiscal year. It's like an unprecedented level of write-off for a company of that size, like a leading corporation on the planet, to write down $21 billion worth of its assets. Because they see these stranded assets situations happening. They see that these fracking companies are not going to make money, and they have to put that on the books for their people who are buying their stock. Next slide. So in the face of, next slide after that, that's Amazon, by the way, another disaster zone, the one that we just saw, along with all the immense repression, violent repression of indigenous people living in, and nations living in Amazon by the neo-fascist government there. There's a literal destruction of the Amazon rainforest and ecosystem that's unprecedented in history happening right now with those fires. So The entire fossil fuel industry is in a death spiral. What can it do? There are two options that they can export, as we mentioned before. This tanker has a Russian name, but it's actually docked at National Grid's facility in England that exists so that countries that produce natural gas can ship it overseas to this facility, from which National Grid exports it to various places in Europe and the Far East. Next slide. Another option for them to increase demand for fossil fuels and to make money and bail out the industry is to take this oil and stuff and turn it into plastics. This is a big plant that Shell created built over the last few years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that takes frack gas from Pennsylvania and makes plastic out of it. Right now, there are plans for $164 billion of new infrastructure in the United States that would turn fracked natural gas into plastic. But the problem is that the demand for plastic isn't likely to be as great as it's been in prior years. And secondly, the developed nations that they are planning as a part of this process to dump plastic waste on, like nations in Africa, like Kenya and other places, they don't want that plastic anymore. So in the industry, analysts are thinking that these projections for profit from petrochemical industries are another example of like big stories that aren't likely to turn out. And they're not working for the companies. So next slide. So when we think of like this whole process of what's happening with National Grid and the phases and everything and how they fit together, the word that we want to bring to mind with regard to all that is a word called segmentation. And segmentation is like a standard operating procedure in the fossil fuel business. So it started, classic example, it started after Keystone XL pipeline, when Indigenous folks in the Dakotas and in Canada were protesting against Keystone XL. The Obama, not Trump, Obama administration started letting fossil fuel companies split their pipelines into hundreds of thousands of small pieces, for which like regulations and review processes that would only apply to larger structures don't apply. And then they use a legal loophole to get around the reviews. So you take a pipeline that runs for 5,000 miles and you classify it as a series of 500 projects, right? That cover only 10 miles. Different standard of evaluation, different levels of public input. That process is called segmentation. Segmentation is used in another way too. And it's used in the way that we're seeing it used here by National Grid. They want to build phase 1, they build the pipeline. They build phase 5, 1 through 4, they build the pipelines. Phase 5 is these LNG facilities. Suddenly in phase 5, there's like features for shipborne carrying liquefied natural gas to supposedly meet peak demand conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To give you an idea of how all this is connected from the beginning of this whole process, it's useful to go back like about a year and a half. The purple line represents what would have been the Williams Northeast Supply Enhancement Pipeline. That was a pipeline they had planned to build, literally digging up the soil, the bottom of New York Harbor to build this pipeline, dredging up toxic stuff that's been there for like 100 years to build this pipeline. The idea was that this pipeline would feed into the National Grid distribution system and then feed the LNG facilities. So to answer a question that came up just before or earlier before, how is this connected to throughput? That person and others that had that question, your intuition is spot on. So the original intent, or the original idea involved a possibility of having the Williams pipeline, which was coming straight from Pennsylvania with a huge throughput of natural gas possible, feeding into the community through the existing pipeline structure that they would build through this phase 1 through 4. The portion of that that services the needs of the communities would be siphoned off, and the rest would be throughput that could be forwarded into these LNG facilities, supposedly for peak. Excess that would be over that could be put onto these very same tankers that are a part of their phase 5 plans and shipped overseas to their own facilities in England and elsewhere. Now, National Grid, mind you, is not saying that this is their business plan, but when you look at the connections in the literature and the things that they write about the export facilities and the configuration of the shipping and everything else that's involved, you can see that if business conditions were appropriate and political conditions were appropriate, it would be very easy for these companies to throw a few $100 million into their operations and convert them into full-blown petrochemical and gas export operations. Next slide. Just so you don't think I'm talking through my hat, here are diagrams from National Grid's business plan that's in the rate case right now, showing the offshore LNG deepwater port, which is fed by a pipeline, which would have been the Nessie pipeline, but now will be any of the other pipelines that they're enhancing or can possibly enhance to feed such an operation. And on the right is the Peak LNG facility, also fed by pipelines. Next slide. This is that grain facility in England that I was talking about. It's one of the largest LNG storage facilities in the world, and it is owned by National Grid. So what if within 6 to 8 years, shipborne fracked liquefied natural gas in excess of domestic demand were shipped on some of those tankers that they propose in their phase 5 plan, like the Russian one that we saw above, across the ocean to England to its huge re-export facility there. They're meeting the requirements, filling their role in the whole system of getting rid of the fuel and making it profitable to buy and sell and produce it again. Next slide. So questions for you guys, and I know we're running over. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can. A lot of information. I hope that it's useful. What are the most confusing things to folks about the fossil fuel business model? And what do you think are the most frightening and unjust things about that model? We've named a few. Yeah, Iman, your remark about peaker plants is actually spot on as well. They all feed that whole concept of the risk and the environmental destruction and the toxification of the community, meeting the reward of meeting the electricity provision and gas provision targets that they set, and allowing them to meet their profit margins by doing so. Okay, lastly, we want to talk a little bit about a subject which has come up in politics and of course is certainly current in the new situation with the election, and that's the Green New Deal. You see the slide. We have X'd out the faces of some people that are pretty decent people and inspiring people, not because we think they're bad people, but because we wanted to underscore the political reality of some of the proposals that they adopt. So because of the way that fossil fuel companies control decisions about energy production in this country, and companies that are dependent upon them for their operation as well, like the automotive industry, it's almost impossible for mainstream politicians to talk about challenging growth. So anything that happens with regard to programs that are supposed to be sponsored by the government to reverse environmental degradation have to fit in with this idea of an economy that grows and grows and grows infinitely with no bounds set by limitations of natural resources, no boundaries set by destruction of the environment, no boundaries set by mass impoverishment of billions of people. Nothing stands in the way of growth, right? It's one of the sacred principles of settler racial capitalism, right? Infinite growth. It's enshrined in the writings of famous economists, et cetera. It's like religious faith for settlers. So you can look at these proposals and see the ways that they green the economies of the developed nations at the expense of others. For example, like the bullet point in the slide shows, the Green New Deal still relies on getting resources like cobalt and lithium, which are used for solar panels and batteries and things like that, from countries like Bolivia. Another example is the way that petroleum resources are extracted in Africa. Anecdote, just to make a connection here. Most recently in Bolivia, the political party that had been cast out of power due to more or less a coup, right-wing coup in the country called MAS, was recently brought back into power. People who supported MAS have been really agitated about a deal that a billionaire scientific entrepreneur, technological entrepreneur named Elon Musk has been trying to cut with companies to extract cobalt and lithium from these countries that have this cobalt and lithium for use in the batteries on these electric cars that he has been producing and trying to develop as an alternative technology. When spokespeople from MAS criticized Elon Musk's involvement with some of the people who had participated in the coup that overthrew their country, Elon Musk's response was, "We'll overthrow your country if we want to. Get used to it." So the idea here is that developing countries and overdeveloped countries get to green themselves. They get to produce energy in terms of from renewable sources, and countries in formerly colonized countries and developing countries and indigenously stewarded resources get to the same old treatment of having the resources taken out of their country. No economic development is produced there, and yet they are the ones that suffer the biggest impacts from the climate change and global warming that's going to take place anyway, despite the expansion of renewable resources. So what we're saying is that the Green New Deal needs to be rethought and reconfigured so that it's not so much about growth and that it's more about social justice on a global level. That the planet that is improved in a certain sense by implementation of the thank you, we coup whoever we want. Thank you, Olga. The developed world that's greened under the Green New Deal makes a sacrifice zone of the rest of the world in its behalf. We don't think that that's a Green New Deal which serves the purposes of justice, and we think that people who are concerned with sacrifice zones and the fate of those in those sacrifice zones, folks who are concerned with the future, the historical legacy and struggles of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people on the planet, need to insist that the Green New Deal recenter and refocus its concerns on equity on a larger scale, and not just satisfying the environmental requirements of developed nations and the people in it for what they call growth at the expense of everyone else. So this is one of the reasons why in our environmental work, we choose to take a disconnected, non-aligned position with regard to mainstream political parties. It's precisely because these parties have a long and persistent history of neglecting these very same interests that we're talking about. It's not about naming people as evil, it's about pointing to what people are actually doing and being grown up about saying that they're doing it and not pretending that they aren't. So we wanted to add that in. So next slide, please. So could you go to the next slide? I'd like to end on this beautiful slide. This beautiful slide is the mountains, as Regan was saying in the beginning, Lenapehoking, which includes Manhattan and areas across the river in New Jersey. This is a beautiful place called Shawangunk Ridge, and it's known as a place where the mists gather. And in the traditional lore of the Lenape people, those mists are thought of being the mists that represent the enduring presence of the ancestral spirits that still maintain their eternal stewardship over the land. This is the last thing I'll say, that this is the antithesis and the opposite, and where we need to go away from the creation of sacrifice zones, namely the recentering and recreation of this kind of spiritual relationship to nature and to the past that you can just feel still exists despite everything in this land that we see right here. They're still here. We're still here. Indigenous people all over the planet are telling us we're still here. And they are. So the conclusion is North Brooklyn is a sacrifice zone, as we've demonstrated amply with lines clearly drawn on all levels. And the solution to end the sacrifice zone, we must confront the empire that profits from it. That's me.
Thank you so much, Tom. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope that's a yes. Okay, great. It is a yes. Awesome. So what I wanted to elaborate on or clarify here is first, want to thank Tom for all of that effort and all of the information that he puts together in this slideshow, and let y'all know that it's truly a pleasure to be educated by Black and Indigenous people on pipeline work, and that everyone who is in this space who is not Black or Indigenous, we are providing y'all with an amount of labor that also insists that we reckon with trauma that has been caused by settler colonialism. So this space in which Black and brown people are educating white people, settlers on our lands, is one that needs to be incredibly respected and understood. So I just wanted to really hammer that home and thank Tom for putting together those slides, for putting together all of this education, for taking time out of your day and your life to educate folks on this phone call. For those who don't know who I am, my name's Regan. I am in the FOBK Coalition and a member of the Indigenous Kinship Collective. I am currently on Shinnecock land at the Solidarity camp. For those who I saw in the chat who are asking about ways to get involved in Long Island, this is how. I recommend going onto Warriors of the Sunrise Solidarity Camp and looking into how you can provide better support to Black and Indigenous people whose land you unjustly occupy on a daily basis. I was asked to come in and to speak on the intersections of the Northland Pipeline with other land defender work and called Turtle Island. For those who are unaware, there has been a number of pipelines that have been put through Indigenous land, obviously historically, but also contemporarily. For most folks, the most poignant one that people are aware of is the Dakota Access Pipeline. And during the Obama administration, I like to point that out because, as Tom said, we don't align with politicians because politicians have their own agendas. We are not accountable to them because they are not accountable to us. So it is important to name whose administrations these pipelines have, when these pipelines have gone through and whose administrations they've been under, so that we can demystify people like politicians that are often put up on pedestals, especially Democrats. There is this long legacy of participating in environmental work when in fact Biden and Harris said it themselves, they will not ban fracking. So let's not look toward politicians for any sort of support or solidarity work. We do the work ourselves. So as I said, Dakota Access Pipeline is probably the most poignant pipeline that folks are aware of. It was halted because of the amazing community work that was done by Indigenous people at Standing Rock, specifically on Lakota Sioux land. Nonetheless, even though that was a win in terms of environmental activism, it was just announced actually a couple days ago that the Keystone Pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline will probably continue with construction, and it is important for us to show up again in support. And yes, I can lump all politicians into one group. All politicians are settler colonists, and all politicians are participating in the continued violence against Black and Indigenous people. Other organizations and other groups that have been really advocating against pipeline work are land defenders at Wet'suwet'en. For those who are unaware, Wet'suwet'en is an unceded territory, an Indigenous territory in so-called British Columbia. The Coastal GasLink pipeline is being forcibly put through the territory without Indigenous protocol, without Indigenous acceptance, understanding. And in the end, actually, Indigenous leaders, hereditary chiefs, have spoken to the pipeline, and the Canadian government has continued to push this pipeline through. It has led to the arrest of a number of Indigenous land defenders, including kin to both myself and other people on this phone call. Wet'suwet'en is still battling against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. It is happening right now at this moment. If you're looking to provide solidarity efforts, Google it. Google Wet'suwet'en, Google Stand with Wet'suwet'en, support the Gittatum camp, put your money where your mouth is, put your efforts where your mouth is, and really come and show up in solidarity for Indigenous people. There's another pipeline going through called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, also in so-called Canada, going through Sepetwuk territory. If you're looking to support those people, I recommend looking at the Tiny House Warriors. It's a group of Indigenous people led by Indigenous women and femmes who are building tiny houses along the pipeline route to end and to slow down the construction process. In the same way, people from the FOBK coalition and the No North Brooklyn Pipeline Coalition put their bodies on the line just a couple of weeks ago to stop the pipeline work. That same land defender work is being done by the Tiny House Warriors in so-called Canada. Another really important historical pipeline that was pushed through and completed was the Bayou Bridge pipeline that went through my tribal homelands of Choctaw tribal homelands and Chickasaw tribal homelands. It was completed, and it is currently poisoning my community as well as other communities, specifically Black and brown communities in the South. So when we talk about the North Brooklyn Pipeline and we talk about sacrifice zones, we know from experience as Black and Indigenous people what will happen. These pipelines will spill. They always do. This is non-consensual work being done on stolen land. All of these are intersected. We cannot divorce one from another. Just like Tom was saying, the conversations about mining happening in Bolivia, resource extraction happening in Africa, and the pipeline work done here in Turtle Island, they are all interconnected, because in the end, they will disconnect Indigenous and Black people from our lands, from our communities, and continue to push forward the settler colonial narrative, which is a white supremacist narrative. The reason that the North Brooklyn Pipeline is not spoken to on the same level as the other pipelines that many folks may be aware of is because we have assumed that New York City is not indigenous land. We have assumed that New York City is in fact a metropolis. It is not. That is indigenous land. The Lenape people still live on their lands. Taino and Arawak people still shape the cultural vibrancy that is Manhattan. Mohawk people literally built this city. Mohawk ironworkers literally built the city. And many of you, I assume, live in Brooklyn on Canarsie land like I do. And this is a reminder that cities are still on occupied, unceded territory of indigenous people, and that the people who are going to take the largest hit when it comes to environmental resource extraction are Black and indigenous people. This is a continuation of settler colonialism, and there's no escaping it. I really do want to advocate that people who are unaware of how to get involved with actions against the North Brooklyn Pipeline look at both North Brooklyn Pipeline and FOBK and get involved in this work in solidarity with Black and indigenous people. It is your duty as people who have inherited the violence of settler colonialism to participate in the ending of resource extraction industries. There is no escaping it. Brooklyn is indigenous land. It is Black and brown sovereignty. It is Black and brown liberation. And if you're actually an accomplice to any of those things, show the fuck up. And I'm not trying to placate any white people on this phone call. I'm not trying to placate any settler on this phone call. Y'all need to show up for this work. Not just donate money, but show up to the actions, continue to show up to town halls, drop money, y'all. People were arrested. This is real work being done in this moment. And in 10 years, 20 years, when Brooklyn is poisoned, y'all are gonna regret not participating in this work. So with that, I'm gonna throw it over to Megan, who's gonna talk about how this is connected specifically to gentrification. And I thank y'all all for this time, and I expect to see you out all on the streets.
Everybody hear me? Oh, okay, great. Y'all can hear me. Okay, thank you for replying. I need just a minute to wrangle the tech because I would like to turn my video on as well. So just give me one moment. Can people see me? No. All right, I'm gonna start video. Okay, great. So I think people can now hear me and see me. Thank you so much, Regan. So my name is Megan Hicks. I am also in the Frack Out of BK Coalition and in Indigenous Kinship Collective. I just left Shinnecock land, was hanging with Regan and some other IKC folks, and have just landed in Brooklyn and have been tuned into the town hall. I think some of the things that I'm gonna say just reframe many things that have been said or restate them in a way that is somewhat simplified. And some things that I'm going to say focus on the connections between settler colonialism and so-called urban development. And what I hope to do is illustrate that these are sort of part of continuous phenomena, if that isn't clear enough already. I think that is quite clear from some of the things that Tom has contributed and the things that Regan has contributed, but I'm just going to sort of restate some of these things in a different way. And what I hope to make clear and to illustrate is that under capitalism, the economic forces that shape urban space are continuous with the process of settler colonialism. First, I think it's important to revisit the definition of settler colonialism, and I'm going to use a definition that was given by scholar Dean Serenilio at Standing Rock Teach-In, who defined settler colonialism as the replacement of one landscape with another, of one people with another, and of one mode of production with another. And I think it's important to say that the ability of capitalist-aligned systems of governance to do this, to carry out these replacements, is underpinned by police force and military force. And that is something that we can see quite clearly when the police show up to take people away for protesting a toxic pipeline in our neighborhoods, right? This is something that we know and we can see with our eyes. But it's important to also restate these things out loud. So we can see that, we can already see that so-called urban development or urban redevelopment has a similar logic to settler colonialism, because the work that's being carried out in the case of the North Brooklyn pipeline, disregards the community that is present, right? Disregards our health, disregards our safety, and disregards our right that is not granted by the state, but that is inherent right to live in a way that is healthy and safe. So we can see this is the same logic that a community displaced or replaced with something that makes more money, something that's judged to be more profitable. And this can be, just to connect us a little bit further, this also joins up other economic projects like gentrification, under the heading of urban redevelopment, so-called urban redevelopment. It joins this up with settler colonialism, that what we see in all of these cases, that a community can be disrupted and replaced by projects that are deemed profitable. And that's important to say out loud, because that is what people are experiencing. Another shared logic in urban redevelopment, settler colonialism, or sort of a shared logic or a shared structure, part of the continuity of the structure of both phenomena, is that we can see that capital is highly mobile, right? So these big chunks of money are really mobile. They can move across borders, they can move around the world, they can be used to purchase and construct infrastructure, they can be used to purchase ships, they can be used to build depots or entrepôts for fossil fuels halfway around the world. These corporations are very transnational. So we can see that capital, these just enormous amounts of money, is highly mobile. And in fact, that it in fact has to stay in motion according to the logic of the system that it's in, which is capitalism. It has to stay in motion, meaning that it has to keep being reinvested, or else it's considered dead or mismanaged. So we can understand that this as one of the shared logics of settler colonialism and so-called urban redevelopment, which are continuous processes. This is another thing that joins these two and makes them the same. It's a context in which we can see that they're part of the same economic process, that capitalism is highly mobile and has to stay in motion, has to keep being reinvested. And at the same time, we see that, well, I think that this example in the definition of sacrifice zones is a really good example of how the mobility of capital is the precise thing that allows capitalists and capitalist projects to disregard local spaces, because the capital can just keep being reinvested, right? It can move. The elite can also move, and this is sort of the weapon that they use to make our communities sacrifice zones. We can't just move, right? A lot of people can't just move. Indigenous people can't just move and won't. It's Indigenous land. And, you know, people in working class communities in Brooklyn can't just up and move. So this is an example in which we can see that the mobility of capital is sort of weaponized, and the creation of wealth can keep moving forward while communities are destroyed. Let me see where I am with my notes right here. And we see, so when we see capital being invested in certain projects, it really doesn't matter to the banks or the private investors. It doesn't really matter to them what the project is. It doesn't matter one drop to them, actually, what the project is. The only thing that matters is that when their wealth is invested in the project, their returns will be greater when the wealth is pulled out of investment, right? That's the only thing that matters to them. So from this, we can get a sense of why they can march forward with turning our communities into sacrifice zones with the sort of heartlessness that they do. And this is another shared logic of settler colonialism and urban development, and it's quite a sinister one. And I wanted to provide you with an example of one instance where we can see that this is even further weaponized sort of one step further. Regan did a good job of talking about other pipeline struggles, and Regan brought up one in Wet'suwet'en territory adjacent to so-called British Columbia and Canada. And in the case of the Coastal GasLink pipeline that is trying to be, that Coastal GasLink and its investors forced through Wet'suwet'en territory, they've actually done an extremely sinister, they've sort of made an extremely sinister move. And they have actually invested the police pension of the police who are protecting the pipeline. They've invested the police pension fund in the pipeline project. So the police are actually protecting the pipeline project in order to directly grow their pension funds. So the way in which they carry out their job and their commitment to their job has now been politicized to align with the success of the pipeline, which has greatly, you can see and you can understand that greatly increases the violence that Indigenous Wet'suwet'en people are going to experience in that instance. And this is another place where we can see that the logics and the spaces of settler colonialism and so-called urban development are extremely continuous. Now, Tom, so that's pretty much what I have to say about this linkage between settler colonialism and urbanism. I might just cruise over to the chat and see if anyone's asking specific questions. It doesn't look like it, but I do want to ask Tom, who is on the panel. Hi, Tom. Tom, I remember that you were interested in me maybe saying a couple of words about courts. And I'm wondering if there's time, did you want me to say a couple of words for just, maybe 1 or 2 minutes about courts and legal precedents. I would probably just talk about one anecdote.
I remember that you gave me some very thoughtful insight into some things that were happening with the Supreme Court with regard to like things in Oklahoma and other places like that, with regard to how the courts are willing to pass rulings that provide token legitimacy to Indigenous governance communities, but waffle when it comes to hardcore capitalist rights versus Indigenous rights. I'm going to stop there and stop running my mouth and let you.
Okay, sure. So I can talk about one case study just really briefly. And I guess I want to start this by just saying that Indigenous sovereignty is necessary, period. Like no ifs, ands, or buts around it. And that the influence of settler courts on the outcomes of Indigenous communities and whether or not they have extremely harmful infrastructure projects barreling through their territories is inappropriate, and is always violent. So that's just where this starts. I can sort of talk about one anecdote that lifts the veil on just how things happen behind the scenes. Like there may be people in the audience who are saying, how is this legal? How is it legal? Why would the government hurt communities? People might be thinking, aren't politicians supposed to represent us? Aren't governments supposed to represent us? But this as it illustrates how the bureaucratization of governance can actually be used for people to evade accountability. So I just want to talk about the Wet'suwet'en example. And it's important for people to know that in the mid-1990s, the federal Canadian Supreme Court ruled and agreed with Wet'suwet'en people that Wet'suwet'en territory had never been ceded to so-called Canada, and that the highest form of governance on Wet'suwet'en territory is the hereditary chiefs. So a Canadian federal ruling agreed that Wet'suwet'en people are sovereign and cannot be overruled by Canada. However, most recently, within the span of the past 2 years, the British Columbia provincial courts have ruled against Wet'suwet'en people and have permitted those rulings, which have been in the form of injunctions. An injunction just means, is a fancy way of saying an order for people to stop doing something. These British Columbia provincial court rulings have ruled not in favor with Wet'suwet'en people and their sovereignty. And these injunctions have ordered Wet'suwet'en people to stop protecting their territory, their unceded Indigenous territory. So we can, you can see here that the sort of compartmentalization of the legal system and the lack of clarity about whether a federal precedent is important in a local ruling, and actually the refusal of people in the provincial government and the federal government to be accountable, all of that is being used to benefit this massive fossil fuel project, which is a $6 billion project, and in which, a lot of public pension funds are invested and banks are invested and things like this. So we can actually see that the legal system is being weaponized the Canadian federal legal system, the provincial legal system is being weaponized against Indigenous people, even on a territory that the Canadian Federal Supreme Court recognized as not even actually having ever been ceded to Canada, right? And I think this is important. It shows that settler courts cannot grant sovereignty to Indigenous people. Their sovereignty is pre-existing of federal courts, and we should not depend on courts and a settler colonial legal system to grant rights or sovereignty to people who it has, for the past 150 or 400 or 400 and some years, who have been directly oppressed by the same system, right? So I think this also gives us an understanding of the importance of activism and grassroots efforts. We should not place responsibility or trust necessarily in systems of governance. We have to organize and create the outcomes we want at a local level. And I think I'll end there. And I want to say thank you to Tom and Zeb for inviting me to be on this panel. And thank you to Regan.
Thank you, Mike.
Tom, do you want to close this out unless there are any other questions?
Yeah, I want to, this is a quick note for everybody, just following up on something that Megan mentioned about the police. It's quite a well-known fact that fossil fuel companies fund police foundations all over the country. But we're going to, we'll produce a list of all the footnoted material and try to make that available somehow to all the folks who were patient and listening to endure us going through all this information on the call. Thank you for your attentiveness. As we've said, our focus is not a negative one. We don't view it as a negative one to exist outside the political mainstream. We view it as rather from its positive aspect, that we are unambiguously, unequivocally, and fully committed to grassroots empowerment, to creating grassroots mandates that don't depend for their legitimation on the roles of politicians within the established binary political system, which, however we feel about really outstanding and very conscientious people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we know that the system, that the gears and wheels and mechanism of that system itself are inevitably set to favor capitalist aims. So our solution is to develop a presence within the society that is not dependent upon that system for its existence, for its power, for its force. So that's where we're going with this. The people with a capital P, italicized. So I think I'm through, Zev. And I thank you for everyone for being a part of this, and again, for your patience, and hopefully, for those who wish to work in a more mainstream way, there's plenty of groups within the coalition who are doing that. For those who wish to do the exhilarating, difficult, and truly radical work of organizing, the kind of organizing that FOBK is opting to do, in concert with our sister organizations in the coalition that are doing other things, come work with FOBK. Whatever your style, there's a place for you to be. So thank you very much for your time, and bless you all, and best wishes for your good health and safety and continuation in the midst of this crazy world. Thank you very much.